The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when I pulled into my driveway with the heavy weight of fatigue clinging to my body. The night shift at the fire station had been brutal and I hadn't gotten more than a few minutes of real rest between calls. Smoke still clung to my jacket. My eyes burned from exhaustion. But all I wanted was to get inside, take a shower, and sleep for a few hours before starting over again. I parked my truck in my driveway exactly the same way I had done for the past 5 years since I moved into this neighborhood. My tires were aligned just right. I wasn't blocking the sidewalk. I was fully within the limits of my property lines. But something about this morning felt different. There was a strange silence in the air, like the neighborhood was holding its breath. As I approached my front door, I noticed a piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. At first I thought it might be a flyer or an ad. But as I unfolded it and read the bold red print, my heart sank. It was a violation notice from the HOA. Apparently my truck was parked at a slight angle and that somehow warranted a citation. The reason they gave was obstruction of community aesthetics. $100 fine. Due immediately. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because of how absurd it was. I had parked the same way every day. No one ever said a word. Until now. And I knew exactly who was behind it. Her name was Karen. Karen Bledsoe. She lived 2 doors down. President of the HOA. Self-appointed guardian of neighborhood order. She had a clipboard for every day of the week and a camera mounted under her mailbox that pointed toward my driveway. She had reported my flower beds for being too wild. My dog for barking too loud. My American flag for being slightly faded. Now she was coming after how I parked my truck. Later that day, after I got a few hours of restless sleep, I went to the HOA office. A small white building tucked behind the community pool and tennis court. The receptionist greeted me with a forced smile and handed me a copy of the violation report. It was signed in large looping letters. Karen Bledsoe. She even attached photos of my truck with a red arrow pointing to the front tire, which was apparently 2 inches too close to the edge of the driveway. I asked for a hearing. She denied it. I requested a review by the board. She shut it down. I tried to appeal through official channels. No response. The next day I received another violation. This time it was because my trash cans were placed out too early. Then another one after that. Untrimmed hedges. Then a warning for leaving my porch light on past midnight. All within 3 days. All signed by Karen. It was a war. One I hadn't started, but one I was now fully pulled into. I tried talking to her once. I walked up to her front yard while she was pruning her already perfect roses and said I wanted to understand why she was targeting me. She didn't even look up. She just said if I wanted to live in this community I needed to respect the rules. Then she smiled a cold, thin smile and added that perhaps I should consider moving somewhere less refined. I knew what she was doing. She wanted me gone. She didn't like that I drove a beat-up work truck instead of a luxury SUV. She didn't like that I played country music while I worked on my car in the garage. She didn't like that I didn't bow to her petty authority. Well, if it was a war she wanted, then she picked the wrong guy. I started documenting everything. Every letter, every fine, every petty citation. I took photos. Recorded conversations. I contacted other neighbors. Turns out I wasn't the only one she'd been targeting. There was a quiet undercurrent of resentment building against her, and I decided it was time to turn that resentment into something louder. I hosted a barbecue in my backyard that weekend. Invited every neighbor I could. Free food, live music, games for the kids. Over 40 people showed up. Karen called the cops 3 times. Said we were disturbing the peace. When the officers arrived, they looked around, saw a peaceful gathering, and left. One of them even grabbed a burger before he went. That night Karen sent out a neighborhood-wide email condemning me. She called me a threat to community standards and a negative influence. She quoted obscure HOA bylaws and demanded I be put under probation. She attached photos again. This time of my guests' cars parked on the street. Claimed they were a traffic hazard. But the damage was done. Her email only made her look more unhinged. Several neighbors replied, pushing back. Asking why she was so obsessed with my life. Pointing out that the HOA had more pressing issues than one man's barbecue or parked car. The following morning I found a new violation on my windshield. Unauthorized parking overnight. This time the fine was $200. And printed in bold below the amount were the words "Final Warning." My truck hadn't moved. It hadn't violated any law. But Karen didn't care about facts. She cared about control. I was furious. But more than that, I was motivated. It was time to hit her where it hurt. I started researching her property. Dug through public records. Looked up parcel maps. After 3 days of digging I found something that made my jaw drop. Karen's driveway, the very piece of land where she parked her Mercedes every day, wasn't actually part of her deed. It belonged to the undeveloped parcel behind her house. A narrow strip of land originally planned as a second access road that had been sold off by the original developer years ago. And guess who owned that parcel now? A property holding company. Out of state. Didn't even realize what they owned. I called them. Asked if they'd consider selling. They said make an offer. I made it. They accepted. 3 days later I owned Karen's driveway. I didn't say a word at first. I just waited. Let her stew in her little victories. She kept sending citations. Kept trying to break me down. But inside I was holding the ultimate card. Then one afternoon as she was coming back from grocery shopping, I stood on her driveway, deed in hand, and greeted her with the warmest smile I could muster. "Hey Karen," I said politely, "you're parked on my property." She laughed at first. Thought I was joking. Then she saw the paper. Read the legal description. The seal. The signature. Her face turned ghost white. "This is harassment," she spat. "No Karen," I said, "it's real estate." And with that I placed a no parking private property sign right at the edge of her precious bricks. That was the day everything changed. And it was only the beginning. Karen stood frozen in her tracks as if she had been hit with a blast of cold air. She looked at the no parking private property sign I had posted like it was some sort of personal insult. Her lips parted but no words came out. She glanced back at her Mercedes, then at me, then at the piece of paper in my hand, like her world was beginning to fracture. I watched her wrestle with the truth, fighting every instinct to believe this could be happening. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I just stood there, calm, steady, and silent, like the stone she had been chipping away at for years, finally turning around to push back. "You can't do this," she said, voice sharp. "You can't just buy my driveway." "Karen," I said, "I didn't do anything illegal. You should have checked your property lines more carefully before parking on land you don't own." She tried to snatch the deed from my hand, but I held it firm and folded it slowly, placing it back into the envelope. "Call the cops," I told her. "I'm sure they'd be very interested to learn you've been trespassing on someone else's property for years." Karen didn't call the cops, but what she did next was even more desperate. The very next day she showed up to the HOA meeting with an emergency motion demanding the association use funds to reclaim the driveway area for community purposes. She said it was essential access. She said it was historic. She even tried to argue that the association had a right to take it through something she called common necessity. But I had done my homework. I wasn't just a tired firefighter with a beat-up truck anymore. I had turned into a force of calculation and planning. I showed up to that meeting too with a printed copy of the land deed maps dating back 20 years. I laid them out in front of everyone. One by one the board members leaned forward, reading the papers with wide eyes. Even the ones who usually supported her started to back away. It was clear. The driveway was legally mine. Karen refused to go down easy. She argued that I was disrupting the order of the community, that I was being vindictive and malicious. I let her talk. Let her rant. And when she was done I asked one question loud enough for everyone to hear. "How many people here have received a citation from Karen in the last year?" Nearly every hand in the room went up. The room turned cold. Her face twitched. Her fingers curled tightly around her clipboard. I could tell in that moment she realized her reign was beginning to crack. She stormed out of the room, red-faced and silent. The HOA didn't pass her motion. They tabled it indefinitely. That week I installed a small security gate across the end of her driveway. I didn't block her car, and I wasn't that cruel, but I made it clear that any vehicle parked beyond that point would be towed. I left no room for negotiation. She had used rules and fines to control people for years. Now she was tasting her own recipe, and it was bitter. She started parking on the street. And wouldn't you know it, the same street she once claimed had parking restrictions didn't apply anymore when it was her Mercedes in the line of fire. But I wasn't the only one watching. One by one the neighbors began talking, sharing stories, showing copies of old violation notices. A quiet resistance formed. People who used to hide behind their blinds now came out and stood with me. We called it the Block Committee. It started as a joke, but it grew fast. We met in garages and backyards, discussed HOA bylaws, brought in legal counsel. Everyone had a story. Everyone had a reason to see her lose control. But Karen wasn't done. Not by a long shot. 2 weeks after the gate went up I came home to find a construction crew parked in front of my house. They were unloading materials, measuring the front yard and digging small holes. I asked what they were doing. The foreman said they were there to install a decorative fence approved by the HOA, right along the property line, including through the edge of what used to be Karen's driveway. I stopped them immediately, told them the land was mine, showed them the deed. The foreman shrugged and made a call. 10 minutes later, Karen showed up, clipboard in hand, with a smug look that said she thought she'd finally found a loophole. "This is a community beautification project," she said, "and the HOA has every right to enhance shared property spaces." "You mean my property?" I said. Her eyes narrowed. "You're obstructing a sanctioned improvement." I pulled out my phone and called the police. Simple trespassing case. The officers arrived, and after a quick chat with both sides, they told the crew to leave. Karen stood behind them, hissing about legal action. But there was nothing she could do. She had no authority over private property. Not anymore. That night someone threw eggs at my truck. Petty, childish. I didn't respond. The next day my trash cans were overturned. I cleaned it up without a word. Then came a fake review of my fire department posted online under an anonymous account. Said I was unprofessional and aggressive. I had that removed in less than an hour. Every petty trick Karen played only made her look weaker. Smaller. Desperate. Then the unthinkable happened. Karen lost the HOA presidency. At the next election, turnout was at an all-time high. People who had never voted before showed up in droves. One by one, the board members who backed her were voted out. Replaced by new voices, people who actually lived here and cared about the community instead of controlling it. I didn't run for office. I didn't need to. I just watched from the back of the room as Karen's face fell when the results were announced. Her clipboard slid off her lap and clattered to the floor. For a moment she looked like she might cry. But no one offered her a tissue. She left the meeting early that night. Got into her Mercedes parked out on the street and drove off without looking back. For a week we didn't see her. Her porch light stayed off. Her blinds closed. The woman who once monitored every detail of the neighborhood was suddenly invisible. Rumors flew. Some said she was planning a lawsuit. Others said she was selling her house. A few even thought she might move in with her sister in another state. Then came the letter. Delivered by courier. A cease and desist from Karen's attorney demanding I remove the gate from her driveway, claiming it impeded her access and harmed her quality of life. She wanted damages too. Claimed emotional distress and neighborhood defamation. I smiled as I read it. Because I had been waiting for this move. I responded through my lawyer. A long detailed letter with attached evidence, records, photos, testimonies, and maps. Not only was her claim baseless, but we countersued for continued trespassing, harassment, and intentional property damage, including the egging and the construction attempt. We gave them 30 days to settle or we would take it to court. The silence that followed was delicious. No countersuit. No lawsuit. No apology. Just nothing. A week later a moving truck showed up in front of her house. Karen Bledsoe, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, was leaving. Neighbors watched from their lawns as she loaded her belongings. Some waved. Most didn't. A few offered half-hearted goodbyes, but no one helped. The same community she had tried to rule now stood by in quiet victory. Before she got into her car she looked one last time at the gate I had installed. The sign still there. Still bold. Still hers, but no longer hers at all. She got into her Mercedes and drove away. We didn't cheer. We didn't throw a party. We just let the peace settle back over the neighborhood like a warm blanket after a long winter. But I knew this wasn't the end. Because what started as a driveway war had uncovered something much deeper. A need for justice. For unity. For change. And I wasn't done. Not yet. When Karen Bledsoe's Mercedes turned the corner and disappeared for good, most people thought the storm had passed. Neighbors began cutting their hedges at ease again, kids played a little louder in their yards, and barbecue smoke drifted freely into the summer sky. It was peace for the first time in years. But I had lived through enough fires to know that the flames you see aren't always the ones you need to fear. It's the ones smoldering under the surface that burn everything down. For the first week after Karen's departure, the new HOA board worked quietly. They cleaned out files from the office, box after box of citations, letters, and photos, all linked to Karen's reign. They tried to reorganize things, hold town meetings, and ask for suggestions. They were honest people, good neighbors trying to fix something that had been broken for a long time. But what they didn't realize was that the damage went deeper than Karen's clipboard. I sat in on a few of those early meetings just listening. There was one where Mr. Carter from the next block stood up and said he had been fined $300 for having a shed 2 inches taller than regulation. The shed had been there since the day he bought the house. No one had ever told him it was too tall. He had paid it because Karen had threatened legal action. Another neighbor said Karen once entered their backyard uninvited to measure fence height, then sent a warning about structural violations. People were shaking as they shared their stories, not just angry but ashamed. Ashamed that they had let it go on for so long. Ashamed that no one stopped her. That's when I realized something that changed everything. Karen had made herself the villain, but the system had handed her the sword. So I started digging again. Public records, HOA budgets, bylaws, communications with county offices. I wanted to see how deep it all went. I spent nights reading paperwork I never thought I'd understand, but the more I read the clearer it got. Karen had amended the HOA rules multiple times in her presidency. Quiet changes, nothing dramatic, just enough to consolidate control. She had altered how fines were calculated and increased late fees. She gave herself authority to enforce rules without board approval. She even rerouted the HOA complaint process to go directly to her office, not the board. Worse than that, she had signed off on thousands in spending for legal threats, mailers, and even surveillance tools. One invoice showed a payment to a private investigator. The same week I received anonymous photos of me talking to neighbors in my yard. I printed everything and called a special HOA meeting. Word spread fast. That night the community center was packed. More people than I had ever seen attend any HOA event. Some stood in the back, others leaned through the open windows. I stood at the front with a folder full of facts and no intention of holding back. I started with the small stuff. Budget misuses, fake violation photos, suspicious spending. Then I moved into the serious things. Illegal amendments to the HOA charter. Unauthorized surveillance. Abuse of power. I laid it out calmly, clearly, one paper at a time. People gasped. Some shouted. A few cried. When I was done, I asked one question. How do we fix this? The room went silent. It wasn't enough to remove Karen. We had to undo what she built. Every rule she had changed. Every punishment she handed down. Every fine, every warning, every fear she left behind. It all had to go. The board called an emergency session. Over the next few days we drafted a repeal of every amendment she passed. We reviewed the fines from the last 5 years and flagged every suspicious case. We brought in a community attorney, someone who lived 3 streets down, and volunteered to help. Together we crafted what we called the Clean Slate Act. It was a complete reset. A fresh start for every homeowner. All pending violations erased. All fines issued by Karen refunded. Every rule she changed reverted to its original version. It would be the first time in the history of our neighborhood that something this massive had been attempted. The day of the vote, we held a neighborhood assembly on the school football field. Over 300 people showed up. Some brought lawn chairs and coolers like it was a festival. Others stood with arms crossed, ready for change. The board read the act aloud. I watched the crowd as they listened. Faces turned hopeful. Eyes that once darted at every passing car now stood steady. The vote passed almost unanimously. With the Clean Slate Act in place, the real healing began. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years started chatting again. People repaired fences, cleaned sidewalks, helped each other move. The air felt lighter, not because Karen was gone, but because her shadow had finally been removed from everything she touched. But then came the backlash. A letter arrived one morning addressed to the HOA office but marked urgent. It was from a firm representing the state HOA alliance. Apparently Karen had been in contact with them even after her departure. She was lobbying to have our HOA disbanded for failing to uphold original codes. They claimed our repeal of her amendments was illegal, that we had created chaos. They threatened sanctions, loss of community funding, and legal action. This wasn't over. Karen was gone, but her reach was still clawing at us. I went back into planning mode. We contacted other neighborhoods, ones that had survived corrupt HOAs. We asked questions, built defenses, created documentation. I coordinated with our city council representative, who agreed to testify on our behalf if needed. We weren't just defending our homes anymore. We were building a case study. A blueprint for how a community could take itself back from tyranny. A hearing was scheduled at the county courthouse. Representatives from the HOA Alliance would be there. So would we. I stood outside the courthouse the morning of the hearing wearing my old fire department uniform. Not because I wanted attention, but because I wanted to remind everyone in that room what I stood for. Protection. Service. Truth. The courtroom filled quickly. Karen wasn't there, but her lawyer was a sharp-dressed man who talked like he had memorized every trick in the book. He spoke first, accusing us of dismantling legal structures, undermining property values, and setting a dangerous precedent. Then I stood up and began the presentation. I walked the room through everything. From the first fine to the moment Karen left. I showed evidence of her manipulation of rules, her intimidation tactics, her personal vendettas. Then I explained how we undid it all with due process, community consensus, and legal guidance. When I finished, I turned to the judge and said the only thing that mattered. This was never about parking. It was about control. And we took that control back. The judge asked questions, took notes, reviewed the files. After an hour he returned with his ruling. He declared our repeal lawful. He said we acted within our rights as a community and that the HOA Alliance had no standing to interfere with our internal decisions. The courtroom erupted in applause. Outside on the courthouse steps people clapped, hugged and cheered. For the first time in months I felt the fight was really over. But as I stood there watching the celebration I knew something else. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something bigger. We had proven it could be done. Now others were watching. The courtroom victory didn't just change our neighborhood. It sent ripples beyond our block. The day after the ruling, headlines started circulating in small local news outlets. Articles with titles like "Neighborhood Defeats HOA Tyranny" and "Homeowners Take Back Control" caught people's eyes. Then a national podcast that covered housing rights picked up the story. They reached out and asked for an interview. At first I was hesitant, but something inside me said this wasn't just about our fight anymore. This was about the thousands of other people who never got a chance to stand up. So I said yes. The host met me at the same school field where we had passed the Clean Slate Act. I told her everything. From the first parking citation to Karen's driveway to the courtroom battle. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished she looked me straight in the eye and said, "This story could change lives." The episode aired 3 days later and the floodgates opened. Emails poured in. Messages from people across the country. Some from tiny towns, others from massive gated communities. All of them had the same tone. Desperation. Fear. Stories of being fined for birthday decorations, of being threatened over paint color. One woman said her HOA ordered her to take down a wheelchair ramp for her disabled son because it didn't match the aesthetic. I couldn't believe what I was reading. It was as if Karen wasn't one person but part of a machine. A broken system that gave power to those who least deserved it and left homeowners trapped in fear. That's when I made the decision. If they wanted help I would give it. Not as a lawyer, not as a politician, just as a man who knew how to fight back. I started a small organization from my garage. I called it Blockline. A place where people could send their stories, ask for advice, and connect with others going through the same nightmare. I created a simple website, posted resources, and shared my full story in writing. Within a week hundreds had joined. By the end of the month we had over 2,000 members. We organized weekly video calls. Neighbors helping neighbors from different states. We had a guy in Texas help a woman in Oregon draft her appeal. A retired judge from Florida joined and offered guidance. A former HOA board member from Arizona admitted he left his position after seeing how corrupt it became. We were forming something real. Something powerful. Then came the first direct attack. An envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a cease and desist letter signed by the HOA Alliance again. This time accusing me of inciting unrest and defaming their organization. They demanded I shut down Blockline and remove all materials referencing their members. I laughed out loud. I scanned the letter and posted it to the site. "This is what fear looks like," I wrote. And the response was electric. More people joined. More stories poured in. We started documenting the worst violations, creating a list of the 10 most abusive HOAs in the country. People were tired of hiding. Tired of feeling powerless. We gave them something simple and dangerous. Hope. Then the media came calling again. A major news network wanted to do a feature on Blockline. They sent a crew to our neighborhood, set up cameras, and interviewed people who had been targeted by Karen. Some cried on camera. Others stood with pride and told their stories straight. They filmed my driveway, the gate, the sign, the spot where it all began. It aired on prime time. Overnight our website crashed from too many visitors. That same night my phone rang. A known number. I answered and heard a woman's voice pause for a long time before speaking. "You don't know me," she said, "but I used to work with Karen." My pulse quickened. She told me she had served as secretary for the HOA during Karen's final 2 years. She kept records on everything, including internal emails and conversations that had never been shared. She said she left because she couldn't stomach what was happening anymore. She was scared. But after seeing the news she decided to speak up. I met her the next day in a quiet corner of a library downtown. She handed me a flash drive and told me to be careful. Then she left. When I got home I opened the files and what I saw made my hands shake. Karen hadn't just been acting alone. She had connections with a regional property management company that had secretly funded legal threats to homeowners. In exchange, the company received kickbacks on contracts for landscaping, security, and repairs. It was a full-blown operation. Dozens of HOAs tied to the same company. Fines were inflated, enforcement was rigged, and every time a homeowner paid a penalty, that money moved through a web of accounts right back into private hands. This wasn't neighborhood management. This was extortion. I called the same journalist who had first interviewed me and gave her the files. A week later, an explosive expose hit national television. They ran the headline. Hidden Empire: How HOA Power Turned into Profit. It rocked the country. News vans flooded affected neighborhoods. State attorneys general opened investigations. Lawmakers started drafting reforms. Suddenly I was testifying in front of panels, giving interviews to publications I had only seen in checkout aisles. But I wasn't chasing fame. I was chasing justice. And still I came home every night to the same house, to the same street where it all started. My neighbors kept it grounded. They brought food to meetings, helped manage the website, volunteered their time. We had become a unit, a real community bound not by rules but by resilience. Then came the moment I never expected. A letter arrived with a gold seal from the governor's office. I was being awarded a state citation for civic courage and community service. They wanted me to speak at the state capitol. Me, the guy with the truck Karen once said ruined neighborhood aesthetics. I stood on the steps of that marble building looking out at hundreds of people, many of them homeowners who had flown across the country to be there. Some carried signs. Others wore shirts with Blockline logos. I saw tears, I saw fire, I saw people who had taken back something that had been stolen. When I spoke, I didn't talk about Karen or even HOAs. I talked about standing up when no one else would. About fighting not with fists or fear but with truth. About never letting anyone park themselves on your rights just because they wear a badge or hold a gavel. And when I finished, they stood and clapped for what felt like 10 full minutes. But I knew in my heart the work wasn't done. Because power like Karen's doesn't just vanish. It hides. And waits. And if no one watches, it returns. That's why Blockline became more than a website. It became a movement. We trained volunteers in every state. Launched local chapters. Began drafting legislation to create HOA oversight boards. We published a book collected from real homeowner testimonies and sent it to every state senator in the country. We weren't asking for special treatment. Just fairness. Just peace. Just driveways and fences and yards free from fear. And I never forgot what started it all. A parking citation. On a quiet morning. After a long shift. From someone who underestimated how much fight I had left. 1 year after I stood in my driveway and told Karen she was parked on my land, I stood on a stage in Washington, D.C. with lights above my head and silence hanging in the air. I had been asked to testify before a congressional subcommittee about HOA abuses nationwide. What began as a small neighborhood fight had grown into a national movement, and somehow I had become the face of it. I looked across the chamber and remembered that this all started with a parking fine written in red ink and sealed with pettiness. I took a breath and told them everything. The officials listened without interruption. I showed them the patterns, the money trails, the fake citations. I gave names of families forced to sell their homes over hundreds in bogus fines. I explained how enforcement was based on vendettas, not values. I told them about the woman with a wheelchair ramp. About the veterans fined for flags. About the children banned from chalk art on sidewalks. When I was finished, no one said a word at first. Then the chairman thanked me and said it was time for the system to change. That change didn't come easy. It took months of negotiation. Lawsuits were filed. Lobbyists fought us tooth and nail. But we had the truth. And we had something else. The people. Thousands of them. They wrote letters, showed up to city halls, flooded online comment sections with stories of injustice. And slowly the walls began to crack. The first major reform bill passed in a small state, but it was a model for others. It limited the powers of HOAs, required open financial records, and made it illegal for any HOA to issue fines without evidence reviewed by a third-party board. Then a second state passed an even stricter law. Then a third. Then the media started calling it the homeowner spring. Blockline exploded in size. We opened our first physical office, funded entirely by donations from the very people who were once victims. We hired attorneys, outreach coordinators, researchers. We even had a hotline where people could call in and get help. Every week more homeowners found their voice. Every week another corrupt HOA fell. And still I lived in the same house. My truck sat in the driveway Karen once claimed was an eyesore. Now it had become a symbol. People drove from other towns just to take a photo next to the gate I installed. Tourists would knock on my door and ask me to sign a copy of the exposé or pose for a picture with their dogs. I didn't do it for attention, but I never turned them away. Because every time someone stood on that concrete, I remembered how it all started. Karen Bledsoe became a name no one could forget. She tried to disappear at first. Moved to another state, changed her name, started over. But the media eventually found her. They asked her for comment. She refused. One reporter said she locked herself in her new house and refused to open the door. But her story had already been written. She was the match that lit the fire. A warning. A lesson. And the best part. Her new neighborhood had no HOA. In her absence, our own community had blossomed. We replaced the HOA with a simple neighborhood council. Volunteers, not enforcers. They helped organize events, shared resources, created programs for kids and elderly residents. There were no fines, no threats, just people looking out for each other. The gardens grew again. The porches were filled with laughter. The silence that once hung in the air was gone. One evening I stood outside watching kids ride bikes through the cul-de-sac and felt something deep inside me settle. Peace. Real peace. The kind you don't notice until it's been taken from you and then returned. My neighbor Carter walked over with 2 beers. We sat on the curb and watched the sun dip behind the rooftops. You ever think about how far this all went, he asked. Every day, I said. It's crazy, he laughed. All from a parking complaint. I smiled and shook my head. No, I said. All from a refusal to back down. That night I wrote the final chapter of the Blockline Guidebook. A simple document that would help other communities fight back. I called it the Driveway Doctrine. The first line read, "You don't need to own a courtroom to win. Sometimes all you need is to own your ground." Blockline continued to grow. We were invited to international housing conferences. Universities studied our movement. Documentaries were made. And through it all we kept the same mission. Protect homeowners, empower communities, and remind every person that they are never alone. I met people who had lost everything and rebuilt because they refused to give up. I saw elderly couples win back their homes. I saw kids write essays about standing up to unfair rules. I met a teenager who started his own HOA reform club in high school. He told me he watched the news story with his dad and said he wanted to grow up to fight for people. There is no better legacy than that. Years passed, but the gate on my driveway stayed up. Not as a barrier but as a monument. A small iron reminder that even the smallest fights can lead to the biggest changes. And I never forgot the moment I turned to Karen that day and told her she was parked on my property. Not because I wanted revenge, but because that moment taught me what power really looks like. It's not about control. It's about standing your ground when someone tries to take it from you. It's about turning one step of defiance into a movement of thousands. It's about a driveway, a truck, and the fire that no citation can extinguish. And so if you ever get a letter in the mail that tells you you're wrong, that you're out of line, that you're not welcome on your own land, don't just fold it up and toss it away. Look at it, read it, then ask yourself one question. What if this is where the fight begins? Because if I learned anything from this journey, it's that sometimes the road to real freedom starts in your own driveway. They thought a parking fine would break me. They didn't know it would start a movement. If you're tired of HOA abuse, if you've been silenced, if you've been threatened over your own property, you're not alone. We're just getting started. This is HOA Confidential, exposing the truth, one story at a time. Like the video, subscribe for more, and never let them park on your rights again.